Alterations, University of Canada, Campion College, and Luther College. The University of Regina is situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories of the Nehiyawak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis and Michif Nation. Today, these lands continue to be the shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and far. So just to give you a sense of what's going to happen today, most of the presentations are 15 minutes long. We'll have about 5 minutes for questions in between those. There are 2 sessions, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, so 3-minute thesis formats. In those cases, students will have 3 minutes to present, and then we'll have questions after that. For those of you that are here that are the presenters, just to give you a heads up, you will be given a 1-minute warning for finishing your presentation. For those of you that are doing 15-minute presentations, we'll also give you a 5-minute warning. But again, please keep to the 5 minutes or 15 minutes so that we can keep going with our schedule. So, first on tap, and I know we're a little ahead of schedule, but that's okay because it'll take us some time to get us moved in between. We have Jessica Lewgood, who is supervised by Dr. Plandowski, and she's going to do a presentation on the effects of whey protein and creatine supplementation on home-based resistance exercise band training in older adults. So I know we got to do all, there's a lot of switching of this that's going to have to happen today.
Okay, good morning, everybody. As Maria said, my name is Jessica Lewgood, and I'm in my second year of the PhD program here at the University of Regina under the supervision of Dr. Neary. I'm excited to be here today to discuss studies that we are looking to conduct on the effects of home-based resistance exercise, band training, and nutritional supplementation in older adults. So as early as the 4th decade of life, we begin to see a biological process causing the involuntary loss of muscle mass, strength, and function. This age-related loss is termed sarcopenia, and individuals will experience a 3 to 8% decrease in muscle mass as they age, with the age-related loss occurring at a faster rate following the age of 60. This is a major contributor to disabilities, falls, fractures, loss of functional independence, institutionalization, as well as death. A decrease in muscle mass can lead to further changes in muscle tissue due to fat infiltration, consequently causing changes in body composition. As you can see here on our slides, on the right is a healthy thigh muscle scan, and on the left is a thigh affected by sarcopenia. There's a noticeable difference in the size of the muscle tissue as seen in the yellow, and also in the fat tissue as seen in the red. You can also note that the sarcopenic thigh shows a smaller amount of muscle tissue and a higher percentage of fat tissue. Physical inactivity and poor nutrition can exacerbate this issue and also contribute to increases in whole body adipose tissue, inflammation, insulin resistance, as well as decreases in bone mineral density, all of which have probable implications for the development of several conditions, including type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, obesity, and heart disease. With age, there's a decrease in anabolic hormones found in the body, such as growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor, as well as there's an increase in inflammation and circulating cytokines. This can cause a catabolic environment within the muscle tissue, creating an imbalance between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. Physical activity and protein ingestion are 2 interventions capable of stimulating muscle protein synthesis. Older adults may still experience a reduced or blunted response to this anabolic stimuli due to anabolic resistance. To overcome this, older adults are recommended to take part in physical activity such as resistance training, as well as to have a higher protein content intake to help stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Canadians were given a grade of D for physical activity participation levels. With access to gyms, leisure centers, and suspension of rehabilitation and group exercise programming. Older adults with underlying conditions such as hypertension, obesity, and diabetes are at risk for having higher infection rates as well as complications from contracting COVID-19. As programming for older adults starts to reopen, they are faced with a difficult decision on whether they take part in physical activity programs and potentially expose themselves to the risk of contracting COVID-19, or continue to self-isolate and social distance, potentially extending sedentary behavior and deterioration of health. Shutdowns can induce a catabolic effect, similar to that as seen as extended periods of bed rest or hospitalization, as you can see on the model of age-associated muscle loss here on the slide. This will lead to a decrease in lean muscle mass as well as strength. Regular physical activity has been shown to be a preventative and recovery strategy to combat not only anabolic resistance and sarcopenia, but other chronic health conditions as well. Center-based programs are able to control and supervise the amount and quality of training, but can be costly to the provider as well as the participant. And participants may be limited in participation due to their location, transportation, time commitment, as well as an individual's comfort level and desire to attend a program. Home-based programming then eliminates many of these barriers to exercise, as it is a convenient and time-effective intervention that requires fewer resources and has been shown to be an effective mode of training in significant improvements for those with osteoarthritis, obesity, Parkinson's disease, COPD, as well as cardiovascular disease. For 2 decades, the UK has offered approximately 10% of its cardiac rehab as a home-based program. When compared with a center-based cardiac program, no significant differences in strength gains were observed between groups. Mechanical stimulation from resistance training provides numerous adaptations in skeletal muscle which may help to prevent or reverse changes resulting from age. Resistance bands may be a key component in home exercise programming for older adults, as they are safe, practical, easy to use, and have a relatively low cost. It has been also reported that older adults have a high acceptance of resistance band training due to its simplicity as also its portability. Individuals are able to perform whole body concentric and eccentric muscle contractions in seated or standing positions, similar to that of free weights as well as exercise machines. Resistance bands can offer an easy way to provide progressive overload for training by simply increasing the number of repetitions performed or progressing to a heavier band. A study comparing traditional resistance training to resistance band training in sedentary adolescents, sedentary healthy adults, and high-performance athletes found no difference between groups for increasing muscular strength. This finding is consistent with several reviews, including studies conducted with older adults and individuals with osteoarthritis and fibromyalgia. The American College of Sports Medicine recommends resistance training to be performed at 70% of 1 repetition maximum to achieve significant muscle growth. This intensity may not be achievable for older adults, as it is difficult to maintain this level of intensity for long periods of time, and the presence of comorbidities associated with aging, such as arthritis, may make it difficult for individuals to lift heavy loads. Low-intensity loading at 30% of 1 repetition maximum with a high number of repetitions or volume to volitional fatigue or momentary muscle failure may be a viable intervention for older adults. Low-load, high-volume, momentary failure is effective in increasing muscular strength through full recruitment of muscle fibers. This can be explained through the size principle, where at the onset of lifting a lighter weight, type 1 muscle fibers are initially recruited. As the repetition intensity is maintained and type 1 muscle fibers begin to fatigue, type 2A and type 2X muscle fibers will be recruited to maintain the force production, resulting in full motor unit activation, meaning that the intensity for required acute muscle protein stimulation is acquired. It has been shown that a single bout of resistance training performed at 30% of 1 repetition maximum to the point of momentary muscle fatigue was equally as effective in stimulating muscle protein synthesis as lows of 9% of 1 repetition maximum. As well as a study of 10 weeks low intensity, high volume training with 3 sets of 20 to 30 repetitions performed to momentary muscle fatigue also showed increases in knee extensor muscle volume in both type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. Now, taking a look at supplementation interventions to curb the effects of aging. In healthy muscle, the consumption of protein stimulates an increase in muscle protein synthesis in a dose-response manner. Whey protein is high in essential amino acids, which serves as anabolic stimuli and building blocks for protein synthesis. It is quickly absorbed into skeletal muscle, allowing for rapid delivery of amino acids to support and enhance training adaptations from resistance training, optimizing increases in muscle strength and mass. As mentioned earlier, older adults or those with acute or chronic conditions may have a blended or reduced response to protein ingestion due to anabolic resistance. They may require higher amounts of protein intake to stimulate and maximize the effects of muscle protein synthesis. Creatine monohydrate is a popular nutritional supplementation used by athletes and increasingly used in combination with resistance training for older adults. Creatine is a nitrogen-containing compound found in red meat and seafood. It's stored in our body within muscle tissue as phosphocreatine and is a key component in energy production for quick, high-intensity movements. In combination with resistance training, creatine supplementation can increase lean tissue mass, strength, performance, and functionality than resistance training alone. With this increase in muscle creatine stores, energy production will occur at a faster rate, potentially activating protein synthesis within muscle fibers and allow for enhanced training volume as well as intensity. The effects of resistance band training and supplementation to prevent or recover from sarcopenia is still to be determined. Our goal is to conduct 2 studies to evaluate the effectiveness of resistance band training and supplementation. So our first study will determine the effects of home-based resistance exercise band training and creatine supplementation versus a placebo group on measures of muscle mass performance in adults 40 years of age or older. Our second study will determine the effects of home-based resistance exercise band training and creatine and whey protein supplementation, so the combination of the 2 supplements, versus whey protein supplementation alone versus a placebo, again on measures of muscle mass and performance in individuals 40 years of age or older. And our third analysis will be the extension of study 2, where we will determine the effects of nutritional intervention cessation from study 2, while we maintain training and evaluate the effects of the intervention on muscle mass and performance without that nutritional supplementation. As I mentioned already, we will be looking to recruit individuals over the 40 years of age or older. They will complete a physical activity readiness questionnaire as well as a 3-day food diary at the baseline as well as at the completion of our study to see if the total energy and macronutrient intake changed over time. The study will be 12 weeks in duration with participants performing a whole body resistance training program 3 days per week. Each exercise will be performed to volitional fatigue or momentary muscle failure. Body composition, including lean muscle mass, will be assessed via a dual energy X-ray absorptiometry scan. Muscle thickness will be assessed at the knee and elbows, flexors and extensors by ultrasound. Muscular strength and endurance will be assessed using leg press and chest press machines. And we will look at individuals' gait and balance assessment through the timed up and go test. Participants will be assigned into one of our 3 groups. First being the whey protein supplementation group, where they will consume 0.4 grams per kilogram per day, post-exercise, or on their leisure days, or leisurely throughout their days on the day they do not train. Our creatine supplementation group will have a loading phase of 0.3 grams per kilogram per day for the first 5 days, followed by a maintenance of 0.1 gram per kilogram per day thereafter, as well as we will have our placebo group. For statistical analysis, we will use the repeated measures ANOVA to assess group absolute changes over time, and relative changes will be assessed using a one-way ANOVA, and significance will be set at 0.05. Any questions?
Thank you, Jessica. Anybody have questions? Yep, hold on.
Thanks, Jessica. Two questions. One is, have you done a power analysis to see how many subjects you need?
No, we have not done a power analysis yet.
They're on holidays. The second one is, depending on your subjects, are you going to group them based on chronological age? For example, you've got 40 and above. We go 40 to 50, 50 to 60. There are big differences between those age groups.
That's something that we haven't determined fully yet, but at one point we did discuss about matching our participants in the groups based off of age or also off of chronic conditions. Because we're opening it up to any individual over the age of 40, we may see a variety, as you said, of age and also conditions to participate in the study. So that's something that we'll have to discuss a little bit further as we get closer to the time.
Right. Okay.
Other questions for Jessica? No. Oh.
Great presentations. If you mentioned for your training program, you're going to have participants working out at home and are going to be training to failure. Would you have sort of a strategy in mind for kind of knowing if they've trained sort of hard enough to get to failure using the resistance times?
One component that Darren and I had discussed was incorporating follow-ups with our participants weekly to continue to promote adherence to the program. And that's one of the things that I came across a lot when looking at home-based versus center-based programming, is having a little bit of supervision does go a long way in ensuring that there's adherence to the program. So either through phone calls, text messaging, or email, just to touch base with our participants to ensure that if they have any questions about how to progress, or just to make sure that they are taking part or if they're having any issues with the program is what we have discussed so far of incorporating.
Other questions for Jessica?
I have one just as a follow-up to that as well, too, because you talked about the UK study. Did they talk a little bit about how they did things like follow-up to make sure that people were participating in the program the same way as they would, and I know that was a part of it, we have program, but in the same way that they would get that supervision in person?
Different groups offer different ways of following up with participants, so there is options through phone calls, emails, or text messaging. Some of them will also offer 1 day a week of training to be done in person, so they would train 1 day a week at the center and then 2 days a week at home. Some would only have, the baseline education of how to perform the exercises and then a follow-up after so many weeks. So there's a variety of different methods that are used to help with adherence as well as to ensure safety and that the participants are performing their exercises appropriately.
Anybody else? Thank you, Jessica, for your excellent presentation. And he's going to be presenting about the effects of creatine monohydrate supplementation in aging adults with type 2 diabetes. I'll turn it over to you, Rob.
Perfect. Thanks, Lorraine. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, so as Lorraine mentioned, my presentation today is going to be on my recently completed master's thesis, which was the effect of creatine monohydrate supplementation in aging adults with type 2 diabetes. And my supervisor again is Dr. Bardutz. All right, so for my presentation today, similar to some of the points that Jessica talked about in her presentation, I will be covering sarcopenia, but also type 2 diabetes, creatine monohydrate supplementation. I will then cover my purpose and hypothesis, participants and methods for the study, discuss some of the dependent variables that we measured throughout the study, just a quick overview of the statistical analysis, some results and limitations that we found throughout the study, as well as conclusions and some directions for future research. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is something called sarcopenia, which again Jessica touched on her project as well. So with sarcopenia, sarcopenia does refer to the age-related decrease in muscle mass, strength, and functionality, with a corresponding decrease in fat mass. So typically, adults will lose about 1 to 2% of their total muscle mass per year over the age of 50, which over time corresponds to about a 1.5% decrease in maximal strength as well. So sarcopenia, although it is multifactorial, the primary contributing factors or causes of sarcopenia include changes in skeletal muscle morphology, or the structure of skeletal muscle itself, declines in neuromuscular function, or the ability of the nervous system to control skeletal muscle, changes in protein or hormonal kinetics, so how our muscles respond to protein or muscle turnover, as well as the hormones that are involved in synthesizing proteins within the muscle themselves, increases in inflammation and oxidative stress, which do increase over time, as well as the development of something called insulin resistance, and changes in dietary nutritional intake as well. So all of these factors essentially contribute to the overall condition which we define as sarcopenia. So due to the magnitude and health consequences of sarcopenia, The World Health Organization has recently identified sarcopenia with the International Classification of Disease for means of better diagnosis for this quite detrimental age-related condition. All right. So sarcopenia may also be a cause and/or consequence of another condition, and that condition being something called type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is a metabolic condition characterized by insulin resistance and increased inflammation and oxidative stress over time. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the condition, are some of the characteristics of type 2 diabetes. Insulin is a hormone that is secreted by our pancreas that does facilitate the uptake of glucose into skeletal muscle. It then opens pathways in the cell membrane, allowing glucose to enter the cell, where it can then be utilized for energy or metabolized or broken down for energy. So the key kind of defining characteristic of type 2 diabetes is the impairment of insulin-secreting beta cells in the pancreas, as well as a blunted response to the hormone insulin itself. So without available insulin to initiate, or adequate insulin to initiate the transport of glucose into the cell for storage or oxidation, that glucose will then accumulate in the blood, causing something called hyperglycemia or glucose toxicity. There have been several studies that have shown that aging adults with type 2 diabetes experience accelerated decreases in muscle mass, strength, functionality, and greater increases in fat mass compared to individuals without type 2 diabetes. This sort of highlights the sort of direct connection between type 2 diabetes and sarcopenia. So therefore, from a healthy aging perspective, interventions that may improve muscle mass, strength, functionality, and decrease fat mass should be considered extremely important for aging adults with type 2 diabetes. All right, so on to intervention. So it is well established that resistance training is an effective anti-sarcopenic intervention which should be considered as a preventative measure against age-related chronic conditions such as type 2 diabetes. However, resistance exercise, especially in disease conditions, might not be a realistic option for everyone. There was a recent review article published by Forbes and colleagues which suggested that low levels of strength and aerobic conditions, primarily as a result of disease conditions or sarcopenia, are reported as barriers to physical activity and exercise, or both. So in addition to resistance exercise or exercise interventions, it is also suggested that nutritional interventions be considered for the treatment of sarcopenia and type 2 diabetes. So one such nutritional intervention, which has been shown to increase aging muscle mass, strength, and functional capacity, is creatine monohydrate supplementation. Creatine is a nitrogen-containing compound which is produced by our bodies in the kidneys and liver, and is stored in skeletal muscle, where it is then broken down during repeated muscular contractions to produce energy or ATP. Creatine consumed through the diet, primarily in red meat and seafood, is then used to replenish these intramuscular creatine stores. However, it is difficult to consume enough food to fully replenish these creatine stores within our body itself. So research does suggest, the large body of research on creatine supplementation is that exogenous creatine supplementation is an effective strategy to increase creatine stores, as well as improve the capacity for energy production during activity or exercise. While creatine supplementation combined with resistance training may be beneficial to offset the negative health consequences of sarcopenia and type 2 diabetes, creatine supplementation independent of exercise may have similar beneficial results effects on muscle strength as well as task functionality. Additionally, there has been a recent body of evidence that suggests that creatine supplementation may improve glycemic control by essentially stimulating something called glucose transport proteins to the cell surface, independent of insulin, thus increasing glucose uptake in individuals with type 2 diabetes. All right, so despite all these potential beneficial effects of creatine supplementation, no study has investigated the effects of creatine supplementation on strength, fasting blood glucose, and tasks of functionality in aging adults with type 2 diabetes. So the purpose of my study was to examine the effects of 7 days of creatine supplementation on muscle strength, endurance, tasks of functionality, and fasting blood glucose in aging adults with type 2 diabetes. We did hypothesize that creatine supplementation would increase strength, endurance, and improve tasks of functionality, and decrease fasting blood glucose compared to placebo in aging adults with type 2 diabetes. So, methods for the study, we did use a double-blind repeated measures design. We were able to recruit 7 participants. They were older adults, both males and females, and they were randomly assigned into 2 groups. All participants received either creatine or placebo, and creatine or placebo were administered in powder form with a dosage of 0.3 grams per kilogram per day, spread out over 4 servings throughout the day. This particular dosage of creatine has been shown to be effective in improving muscle quality and intramuscular creatine stores in older populations without resulting in any adverse side effects. So for our study, the average dosage based on participants was about 25 grams per day. Independent variables that we measured throughout the study, we measured fasting blood glucose, we assessed muscular strength via 1 RM, 1 repetition max chest press, leg press, and hand grip strength. We then assessed muscular endurance via maximum repetitions performed using 50% of 1 repetition max for chest press and leg press, as well as we assessed task of functionality via a 6-minute walk test and a 30-second sit-to-stand test. Our statistical analysis, we did a group creatine versus placebo versus time, baseline versus post, repeated measures, NOVA, to assess the absolute changes over time. Relative changes were assessed using that one-way NOVA, and we set our p-value at 0.05. Right, so as for a quick summary of the results, we found that after the 7 weeks of supplementation, all groups in creatine and the creatine and placebo group did improve their 1 RM leg strength as looked by the graph. So there, our first graph to the side there, so all groups did improve. We also saw improvements in 30-second sit to stand repetitions with all groups as well. So there were no other differences or interactions between groups. There were also no reported negative side effects throughout the supplementation protocol as well. So we got sit to stand via the graph here, you can see it did increase in all groups. However, fasting blood glucose did remain the same. All right, so on to some limitations of our study. Obviously, the very first one was the low number of subjects we were able to recruit. Unfortunately, when we started the study, and got ethics, it was February 2020, so a lot of things happened right then. We had to change the study very drastically from the first proposed. So we were not able to recruit very many people once research was able to be up and running at the university. It also placed restrictions on what we were able to do in terms of research with one-on-one restrictions on what we could do and how much time you can spend with people. So the COVID-19 pandemic also had a very big impact on that, as well as participants not wanting to come into university or not wanting to come do research. So it was very, very challenging trying to get anybody to come into the university to do any kind of study. The second or third point, I guess, would be that we were not able to perform any resistance training as well. Most of the research on creatine supplementation has shown beneficial effects when combined with resistance training. However, there is an emerging body of research showing that creatine supplementation independent of exercise may also be very beneficial. So having that measure would also be beneficial for changing things over time. We are not able to measure dietary creatine. We don't do any dietary creatine measure, as well as intramuscular creatine measures or measures of mechanisms as well. And we were, because of our participant groups, we were not able to, participant numbers divide up via biological sex. So participants were combined as into both males and females, which research has shown that males and females may respond differently to creatine supplementation. So conclusions and considerations for future research. 7 days of creatine supplementation did not improve strength, endurance, fasting blood glucose, fantastic functionality in older adults with type 2 diabetes. Future research could look at physiological mechanisms which may have caused or not caused changes. Obviously, a longer study duration with more participants, and the addition of an exercise intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Questions for Rob?
I have a question. Can you explain a little bit more about how sex could influence some of the findings that you've been having?
Yeah, so there has been studies that have looked at how different sexes respond to creatine supplementation that are essentially stated that females may respond differently, but maybe less responsive to creatine supplementation. So when combined with males who may respond higher, would essentially influence sort of the changes that may have actually happened via the supplementation. So different dosing strategies may be needed to kind of offset that depending on biological sex.
Okay, well, now I'll answer my. All right. We'll go with Scotty and then we'll go Patrick.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to, I guess, clarify, was the total duration of the study 7 days? So we did testing, and then 1 week later did our post-testing?
Yes, so we did the initial baseline testing. After that, they received the creatine. Once they received the supplement, they took it for 7 days, 4 times a day, and then after they were completed the next day, we did the post-test.
And then prior to the week of supplementation, was there action put in place for them to have not taken dietary creatine or supplemented with creatine?
Yeah, so they had to not take, one of the exclusion criteria was having taken creatine within the following 12 weeks. So if they had taken creatine before then, they would have been excluded. So the cutoff was essentially 12 weeks without taking the creatine supplement before this.
And then finally, what was the rationale for doing 1 week versus a longer duration?
A couple things. We were originally going to be doing a longer study. Once we found that it was getting to be very difficult to recruit people, we did look into research which had looked at shorter duration of loading phases. And they did note that like shorter duration studies, 7 to 10 days, did elicit changes in strength and endurance and tasks and functionality. So we kind of use that as our basis for we can sort of justify a shorter study because it was so hard to just get people there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Just one question. Because of your low N, have you thought about or have you looked at the data on a case-by-case basis to see if any one particular individual responded?
We sort of talked about a few things, so that has not come up yet, but it could be sort of a potential for kind of expanding on the data we have for direction for future research. So that's definitely something that we would be considering for sure. So.
Great presentation, Rob. So just with regards to what you talked about with how creatine can help potentially aid in glycemic control,
Yes.
I was just curious as to whether or not that was independent creatine or creatine plus resistance exercise, just to kind of tease out that potential confounding impact of exercise-induced glycemic.
Great question. They were actually both. So there's been 2 studies that have looked at creatine with resistance training on GLUT4 translocation, and then independent of exercise as well, essentially as a loading phase, looking at glycemic control and absolute blood insulin level or glucose level. So they have looked at both, and essentially the mechanism seems to be the same. Is that the supplementation seems to stimulate the GLUT4 transport proteins to the cell surface, though probably to a greater extent with exercise, but exercise or resistance training would cause that effect as well. So, thanks.
Got time for one more question?
Obviously, we ran stats with 7 people, and the script was kind of like half the top donut. We'll do our best to publish it. But one thing that's really important was, did anybody report any side effects?
No, that was the biggest thing, is that they had no reported incidents or side effects from the supplementation. It was a higher dose, so there was one person who said they thought maybe they were getting a little bit sort of bloated just from having it all the time, but they said it wasn't unmanageable. That was the only kind of reported effect from everybody else. Nobody else had any issues with it at all, so that was very positive, kind of reinforcing the safety and of the supplement itself. So.
Thank you, Rob.
So just a little bit of an overview today of what I'm going to be going through. So just taking you through a little bit of a lit review on creatine again, and then also drop set resistance training. Then I'll go through kind of my purpose and hypothesis, research design, and my stats at the end. I forgot to add that in my overview there. All right, so we're all going to be professionals by the end of the day with all the creatine talk, but creatine is mostly widely used for athletes, or that's where it most commonly comes up, but creatine is naturally produced in the body. You can also get it from red meat and seafood, or for most of us know it as its synthetic form, which is creatine monohydrate. So creatine is an organic nitrogen-containing compound found in red meat and seafood, just to reiterate on that. And the purpose of taking creatine, or why most are interested in it, is increasing those phosphocreatine stores to improve the ability to resynthesize ATP following short-term high-intensity exercise. So 95% of creatine is stored in your muscles, the remaining 5% in your brain, heart, other tissues as well. Athletes and those that I'm interested in studying, creatine monohydrate supplementation is that increase in strength, power, endurance, muscle mass, resistance to fatigue, overall for that improved performance and kind of increased recovery time as well, or decreased. Going back, so kind of how it works, so I had a little bit of a diagram on the slide before that I wanted to point out here. A little bit easier for me to explain through this one. So just a little bit of the mechanistic actions of kind of what's happening. So creatine is kind of shuffled into that cell. We do make our ATP in that mitochondria, but it's not as easily dispersed through that barrier coming along the outside. So creatine kinase kind of uptakes that phosphocreatine and kind of turns it into ATP, as there's a lot of ATP kind of sitting around as we exercise, and then just kind of going from there and creating that energy that we are looking for, what possibly athletes are looking for to kind of keep working out, maybe for a longer duration, and increase that intensity for a longer time. So just again, kind of going off of how it works, just reiterating on that. So being able to strength train, again, with that duration at a higher intensity for a longer period of time to try to increase and get those gains. So I'll talk about drop step resistance training, the other component to my study. I found this really interesting as I didn't know a ton about it. I tried to incorporate it even in the last little while with my clients. We've had major people who've really enjoyed it anyways. So basically it's training to that failure, so you're taking 80% at that baseline of that 1 repetition max of your client, no rest, immediately dropping it to that 30%, and then doing again those repetitions to failure at that set weight. 1 to 2 minute rest, and then you will repeat. So for instance, say I've got 100 pounds is my 1 rep bench press. I'm going to take 80 pounds, do as many reps as I can, immediately drop it to 30, and then do that again all the way to failure. The idea of this is promoting muscle hypertrophy and increasing that muscle mass and strength. Those that have been interested in it is time efficient. It is relatively safe from the research that has been done on it currently. So taking a look at the 2017 study here, drop step resistance training and creatine on untrained aging adults. So you can kind of look here at the pre and post of the creatine and the placebo group and having that kind of significant change pre to post, adding that extra supplement on top of that drop step resistance training. And then even furthermore, you can look at the creatine group and the placebo in your chart there to the right with the leg press, hack squat, chest press, pull down. So you've got your strength and you've got your endurance, and you're seeing increases in all of those there. All right, so I chose to do my study, or focus my study on females, mainly because overall in the exercise performance field, they are understudied. And then also with creatine among females is also understudied as well compared to the male counterpart. Creatine kind of characteristics between the males and females, they exhibit 70 to 80% lower creatine stores compared to males. And then just again to kind of go off of a meta-analysis done in 2020, 656 studies used the intervention of creatine supplementation, and only 9% of them were female only. So my purpose and hypothesis is to investigate the effects of creatine supplementation versus placebo and that drop step resistance training for 12 weeks. I am choosing to do the 0.1 grams per kilogram of body mass per day rather than the higher dosage. Again, just maybe to weed out a little bit of that water retention that women seem to be a little bit nervous about. And again, taking that study and looking at young, physically active females. It's hypothesized that the combination of creatine, supplementation, and that drop step resistance training is going to have greater physiological adaptations than the placebo. So my research design, choosing that double-blind repeated measures randomized into those groups, looking at taking or hopefully getting my 30 females, ages 18 to 35 years of age, looking at kind of contacting them through word of mouth or just kind of resources here at the university, starting with that physical readiness questionnaire, exercise history, just to kind of weed out any of the criteria that they may not fit under. And then also, again, with that drop set resistance training program, doing that 80% at baseline, followed by that 30% to failure, 12 weeks, 3 days per week, and they will be consuming creatine also on those off days as well as those training days. So my primary dependent variables here, looking at body composition, so lean mass, fat mass, through the use of DEXA. The regional muscle thickness, elbow and knee flexors and extensors, as well as ankle, plantar, and dorsiflexors, flexors through the use of ultrasound. Strength is the leg press and chest press, 1 repetition max, and then also looking at that endurance set, going to fatigue. Very interested in the power output of it as well, so I'll be testing vertical jump and then also medicine ball throw, and they will be keeping a diet record of that 3-day food record. For my statistics, the group and time through repeated measures of NOVA, looking at that relative change score percentage, and then my p-value will be set at 0.0. I know I sped through that really fast. Questions?
Hey, Chelsea. Questions for Chelsea?
Great presentation, Chelsea. Were you going to be including vegetarians in your study or not?
That's a good question. No, I actually never looked at that. But definitely something to consider. I was just looking at the young female athletes, but I haven't really actually gone that far into looking into that. So it's a good deal.
Thanks, Chelsea. That was very, very good. I'm sort of curious if you've thought about birth control, menstrual cycle, things like that. How are you going to control? Are you just going to ask the females about that, or do you think that's even a relevant factor to consider?
I definitely think it's relevant. Haven't gone actually that far into thinking how to record something for that, because obviously trying to just consider to like the females' kind of privacy and how they might want to actually consider doing that. So that is a component that I would like to add to the study and make sure that we do kind of detect or kind of watch for that as well and document it, as it could definitely play a factor.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'm curious, you included some measures of power there. I think there was a med ball toss or throw and a vertical jump. Do you think those are going to go up or down, and why do you think that?
I'm thinking that they're going to go up just because of the duration of our 12 weeks, and then from those, when you're kind of just testing and their strength going up, I would expect it to go up a little bit. More so their strength adaptations I would assume would go up, but even just with them increasing their muscle mass and then the effects of creatine kind of helping them to hopefully train at that higher intensity, we will see some of those power outputs go up as well. I don't predict they're going to go down, but again, I'm not too sure.
Other questions for Chelsea? I have a follow-up one. It's following up from Jessica's presentation. So in Jessica's presentation, she talks about older adults being 40 plus, and yours are younger and stops at 35. Any consideration of putting people who are 36, 37, 38 as the younger? Or any thoughts on that?
Yes. So there is thoughts about kind of changing that age range to have it a little bit higher. Just to, again, we should talk about sarcopenia and that kind of stuff that has been more prevalent more recently, and so that could be something to consider of just changing the age range. It might also get me more participants with the study as well. So.
Any other questions for Chelsea? Yep.
I noted you indicated diet was a dependent variable. Can you explain that to me, how that's going to be a dependent variable and how you intend to use that in that way?
I would like to look at it just at the beginning of the study and at the end of the study, just kind of, it's like looking at how that might play a factor on maybe what their, if that consumption, I guess, of what they're doing plays more of a factor than actually the creatine has, and then the drum-set resistance training, but I haven't actually looked too far into of how I'm going to control that really for each side. So.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody? Oh, yep.
So you said younger females might be worried about the water retention with the creatine monohydrate. Have you looked or thought about maybe using that creatine HCl or pH balances? Typically, they have less water retention, and like, would there be a major difference between the two?
So the research that I have done behind that is that there's not massive, like a big difference. There's not much of a difference. And with me using kind of that lower dosing strategy over a longer period of time, again, I do predict that it's not going to have that effect on them. And also those other forms of creatine, from again the research that I've kind of read through, they're just more expensive and they're not really benefiting, or there hasn't been any science that has supported behind that they're more beneficial or they show any of these extra kind of gains or benefits to females anyways. So hopefully that answers the question.
Got time for one more question?
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
Chase had a really good point. So for everybody in here, I just want to give you a bit of clarification. The only creatine ever
Are you talking to the mic, please?
Oh, the only creatine ever to use is monohydrate. All the other purported ones out there are scams. They have that contain the creatine molecule, and it's got to get in the blood and then in the muscle. And none has ever been shown to do that. So if you're ever thinking of this for your thesis or whatever, just do a little bit of research on that and just base it on evidence-based research. So I just had to chime in there on that.
All right, well, thank you for everyone for your questions, and thank you, Chelsea, for your presentation. have a few minutes for questions, and then we'll go to our second one of 3 minutes and finish with that. So again, just a slightly different style. It is one that we're starting to see now in more competition for graduate students, so I offer this as an option for students to do. So our next presenter is Josef Singh, and on behalf of the rest of his authors, he's going to be presenting on alterations in heart performance indices in patients recovered from COVID-19 with sustained symptoms. So I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Okay, so like Lorena said, my name is Jyotpal Singh, and my presentation is called Alterations in Heart Performance Indices in Patients Recovered from COVID-19 with Sustained Symptoms. So usually when people get COVID-19, they tend to recover within a couple of weeks. There are some people, though, that tend to have symptoms that prolong between 4 and 12 weeks. This group is known as those with ongoing symptomatic COVID-19. And then if this stretches beyond the 12-week point, it's termed post-COVID-19 syndrome. So as far as acute COVID-19 goes, we know it affects the heart because the virus attaches to these receptors called ACE2 receptors. And these are densely located around the respiratory and the cardiac area. So as such, while we know that acute COVID-19 can result in cardiac complications, what we don't know is what the potential long-term implications are. Furthermore, we also don't know how those with COVID-19 cardiac and respiratory complications compared to those with respiratory disease or cardiac disease. So what we ended up doing was included about 4 different groups here. So we have a respiratory group, and this group has either asthma or COPD. We've got the cardiac group. This group has either hypertension, diabetes, or a combination of the two. And then we also looked at acute COVID-19 people, so these are those who are symptomatic within a 14-day period from symptom onset or positive test result. And then we also included patients who are still symptomatic after that 4 to 12-week period. We got them a cardiac sensor, which is just right on the top left side there. This sensor just goes right on the sternum for 1 minute. It's able to measure the vibrations of the heart. And by looking at the vibrations, we're able to map where the valves of the heart are opening and closing. This is a very important factor because that can allow us to map the whole cardiac cycle. And as such, we calculate performance indices, so HPI, SPI, DPI, and these are factors that tell us about the stress levels in the heart. Generally speaking, when patients are under more severe conditions, we see these giant increases or decreases in performance indices. In this case, we were expecting to see an increase, but rather we actually saw a decrease in heart performance, systolic and diastolic performance index in COVID-19 with sustained symptoms. And when we take a look at the factors that make up these performance indices, it looks like the reason this was happening is because the time from which the aortic valve opens to the aortic valve closes is prolonged in those with sustained symptoms. So essentially what's happening is, while we know that myocardial deformation is common in those who have recovered from COVID-19, we're also finding now that it takes a lot longer for their heart to get the blood out into the body than normal people who have not had COVID-19. Thank you.
That was a great time. This is hard to do in 3 minutes. Questions for Joe?
So these changes, that in terms of the valves, or the one particular valve you mentioned, the difference in the timing of it opening and closing, how does that relate to symptoms? Things like shortness of breath or other symptoms that might be common with cardiac conditions. With this, if there's longer duration for the valve being open, would that potentially relate to any symptomatology that the person might have, or complicate things from a sort of functional standpoint?
Right, yeah, so it all entirely depends. If you see people who have exacerbated COPD, for example, and they're having rapid onset of shortness of breath, you'll see the systolic time interval does greatly decrease, which increases these performance indices quite a bit. So in this case, majority of our participants just had extreme fatigue over everything else. And with this fatigue, it seems like there's fatigue in the myocytes of the heart as well. And that's what seems to be causing that it's the systolic time intervals can relate to the symptoms, but in this case, it has nothing to do with the shortness of breath aspect of it.
Thanks, Joe. Do you know how many people in the COVID specific had the vaccine prior to or after?
So in our sustained symptoms, 0 had the vaccine prior.
Okay.
So yeah, we controlled for that, and afterwards, I'd have to follow up with them again to figure that out. But I'm guessing all of them.
Thanks, Joe. You mentioned that the sustained COVID group is anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks.
Yeah.
Did you find any differences between those that were around 4 to 6 weeks versus those that are 10 to 12 weeks?
So I haven't stratified it that way. A big reason why is because of the sample size. We've only got 17 in the sustained symptoms. So I'm trying to think back now, but if I were to do that, I'd assume that I have maybe 2 people in one group compared to 10 in another group, and that would just make it very difficult to do any kind of analysis on that.
Any other questions for Joe? All right, thank you, Joe, and thank you for all the questions.
intern, hopeful graduate student look at the future here. Barclay and I have been looking at comparing back squat velocity to counter movement jump height in order to assess athlete readiness. Athlete monitoring is becoming a large part of the team sport dynamic. The more we can minimize fatigue, the more we can maximize on-court and field performance while also minimizing injury risk. Technology is advancing, and there are more ways than ever to assess readiness in athletes. Here at the U of R, we want to begin using this technology in order to track neuromuscular fatigue within our own athletes. It is well studied that counter movement jump height is an effective means of measuring fatigue in athletes. However, it can be very time-consuming. Having to run the same standardized warm-up, having up to 30 athletes in a single training session, and only one coach to lead it all, can ultimately take away time from the training session itself, which is not ideal. Therefore, we want to try to find a more efficient way to track fatigue in athletes. Hence why we want to look at the mean concentric velocity of the barbell back squat. Using a Rep 1 linear position transducer unit, we're able to calculate individual load velocity profiles for every individual athlete on campus. Not only do these units measure maximum strength capacities, they can also tell us how fast an athlete can move any given load. Once this data is collected, we are able to calculate their given load at a mean concentric velocity of 1 meter per second. It is this speed that we want to use to compare to counter movement jump height across the year and track fatigue changes. This load is equated to about 50% one repetition maximum. Therefore, it would be easy enough to incorporate into a training session warm-up and not take away time from the training session itself. Over the last 8 months, I've been able to collect data on 7 different Cougar and Rams athletes using the barbell back squat velocity. Every week, these athletes would come in, they'd perform 3 back squats at the speed of 1 meter per second, they'd perform 3 counter movement jump heights, and they would fill out a subjective wellness questionnaire. After reviewing the data, we found a correlation between the 2 main variables there with the back squat velocity and the jump height. Upon calculation, we found that our athletes were moving a load at approximately 40% 1 rep max as compared to the study 50% 1 rep max. The reason for this, we may be able to infer with this, that the load itself is too light to track any significant changes, and there may also be the training effect that the athletes weren't accustomed to moving loads quickly. So with that, going forward, we hypothesized that using a load of 50% 1 rep max as compared to a standardized load at 1 meter per second may be more efficient in monitoring fatigue long-term in our athletes.
Again, impressive, doing that in 3 minutes. Questions for Cameron?
Thanks for the presentation, that was great. My question is, when we're looking at back squat velocity, I believe there's like obvious sort of differentiation between different athletes where, what velocity they can handle their maxes versus their rep work. How much data would you suspect that you need to collect on an individual athlete to be able to plot these sort of speed velocities versus their percentage of 1 repetition max to defer if they're training at their sort of top end velocity or they're training below that?
So you mean like in terms of like where their velocity is based on strength, or?
Like if I had to calculate, if I wanted to look at my top end velocity versus my rep or speed velocity on the back squat, how much collection or how many sort of sets of different reps and different speeds would I have to collect in order for that to be accurate? Or is it quite consistent among multiple athletes?
Yeah, I think that's the difference between athletes. Like when collecting the load velocity profiles themselves to measure the difference between the velocities and the strength capacities, what we did was we performed like an empty bar back squat, and then from there we did a load at 20%, 40%, 60% 1 rep max for 3 reps, and then 2 sets at 80% and 90% is where the athlete's former like testing numbers were at. And then from there we were able to compare both the speed and the velocity and the weight itself and plot that. And then from there be able to determine kind of whether or not an athlete would be more strength dominant or more velocity dominant. And then from there calculate different numbers based on different loads in order to find and part, we had pretty good success with using the equations to spot on, find the numbers, and find the speed. It's very cool.
Very cool stuff, yeah.
So Kevin mentioned that the participants who were recruited were from different sports. Do you think that the sport they play would influence how fast they would be able to meet the bars based on the characteristics of that sport itself?
You can definitely consider it. However, it was pretty similar across most athletes. Like I had volleyball athletes moving moving higher percentages at a faster speed compared to football players, which is something like you wouldn't typically expect just thinking about it. Right, but between the majority of the athletes studied were football players, volleyball players, and basketball players. So all pretty similar in terms of like power sport where they need those kind of quick, high outputs. So probably not too big of a difference between those, but obviously if we were to do something like a long distance track athlete, then probably then we'd expect to see different changes there.
Thanks, Cameron. Did you have a mixture of male and female? I didn't catch that.
Yes, we did. We had two female athletes and 5 male athletes that we were actually able to pull data from.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for Cameron? I have one quick follow-up. So Cameron, you were talking about maybe applying to do this for going to grad studies. Is this a topic that you would like to look at as a graduate student or something else?
This would be one of the things I was thinking about doing for grad studies. Another thing I was interested in doing would be comparing just the different outputs and how much more velocity an athlete could get involved in creatine versus like non-creatine athletes, see kind of how that power changes athlete to athlete.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cameron. Thank you so much for your presentation and questions.
2018 study estimated there to be 4 million sport-related injuries in the United States every year, and that costs our healthcare system about $2 billion. Not to mention the effects it has on the athletes themselves, from their physical health, mental health, emotional health, and a decrease in the quality of life. So there has been a lot of research done on how to prevent musculoskeletal injuries, but a lot of it does relate to things such as biomechanical factors, neuromuscular control, or physical fitness. So in order to prevent injuries, the first thing we have to do is understand how they occur. So injuries occur to predisposed athletes when there's an inciting event that causes the injury to occur. So athletes are predisposed when they have risk factors for musculoskeletal injury. That's what's on the screen here is some risk factors that we know cause musculoskeletal injuries. So risk factors can be broken down into two separate categories. On the left-hand side, you see intrinsic or internal risk factors, and those are related to the individual themselves. And that can be further broken down into biological or psychological risk factors. So biological risk factors are things like your health, your fitness, age, gender, and then psychological factors relate more to your mental status. So if you're under major stress, that would be a psychological factor. What your goals are, what motivates you, that kind of stuff. On the other side, you have external risk factors, and so those relate more so to the environment you are competing in or you're participating in. So we have physical risk factors, so those are things such as what the weather is like, the condition of the field, what sport equipment you have. And then there's the sociocultural risk factors. So that more so has to do with like the norms surrounding your sport, what pressures you have from coaches or teammates or parents and stuff like that. So one of the risk factors that I decided to focus on in my study was history of previous musculoskeletal injury. So this has actually been shown to be the most significant risk factor for future injury is having a previous injury. The definition of musculoskeletal injury is any complaint of the musculoskeletal system. So that includes your muscles, bones, and ligaments. Some reasons that have been cited for this increased risk is a compromised static and dynamic stability of that joint. So after injury occurs, that joint is not as stable. Deafferentation to the joints, that has to do with the nervous system. Now the nervous system in that area is not working as well or not firing as well. And we do see altered kinematics and proprioception, and that might be directly in that joint or that could be elsewhere in the body if you compensate because of your injury. That can cause future injuries in that location or in different locations. This is further compounded by poor rehabilitation after injury and also premature return to sport. So returning to your sport too early. The other risk factor that I included in my study was a history of concussion. So this is a little bit newer in the literature. It's kind of coming out more so now. And what a concussion is, it's a traumatic brain injury induced by biomechanical forces. And so those forces can either be a direct blow to your head or neck, or a direct blow elsewhere in the body that transmits forces to your head or brain. So this decrease, the impacts of concussions is not fully understood why we see an increase in musculoskeletal injuries. Some theories that exist is the deficits in balance and gait. So for up to 6 years after concussion, we've seen decreases in balance and gait in individuals who have sustained a concussion. There's the decreased ability for motor planning that we've seen after a concussion. We've seen a neuromechanical decoupling effect after concussion, so that's the ability for your muscles to change their tone in order to stabilize the joint while you're doing your activities or while you're exercising. And then the last one is a decrease in neurocognitive performance. So we see this after concussion, and that's kind of where my research is on neurocognitive performance and how that relates to musculoskeletal injuries. So neurocognitive performance is basically how well the central nervous system is functioning. And in the sport world, we see that there's 4 dimensions that kind of encompass your neurocognitive performance. So the first one is your visual attention. So that's your ability to intake the vision, but also ignore kind of the external stimuli that you don't need. Second one is self-monitoring. So that's your ability to focus on the proprioceptive or kinesthetic feedback that your body is giving you. Third one is agility or fine motor skills. So that's the ability to make small adjustments in your motor patterns as you're doing your activity. Third one is processing speed or reaction time. So that's your ability to quickly react stimulus. And the last one is dual tasking, so that's your ability to engage in two activities at the same time. So what the purpose of my study was, it was to look at the relationship between neurocognitive performance, so baseline neurocognitive performance in athletes, and if there was a relationship between future musculoskeletal injury and severity of musculoskeletal injury. There's actually been 7 studies published to date on this topic. It's a fairly newer area of research, so there's not a lot. And 5 of those studies did show a relationship between neurocognitive performance and musculoskeletal injury. So when people had lower neurocognitive performance, they were at an increased risk of musculoskeletal injury. 6 of those studies utilized reaction time as their measure of neurocognitive performance. The other one used the standardized assessment of concussion test, which is a pen and paper test. All the other ones use computer tests to measure reaction time. And that one that used the concussion test actually didn't find any relationship between the neuromuscular or neurocognition and injuries. So for my research, I utilized the University of Regina Rams football athletes. We had a total of 87 participants. And I did 2 different analyses. I did a linear regression and a logistic regression. For the logistic regression, my dependent variable was the onset of lower extremity musculoskeletal injury. So the definition was they sustained or they had a complaint to their musculoskeletal system. It had to be acute. They needed to require medical attention for it, and it prevented them from participating in their sport for 1 or more days after the date of injury. For the linear regression, the onset was just yes or no, whether they got injured or not injured. The linear regression was severity of musculoskeletal injury, so that was, we defined that by the number of days that they were restricted from participating in their sport. And then the independent variables were their musculoskeletal injury history, so that was collected for the past 5 years, what their musculoskeletal injury history was, and we just left it to lower extremity musculoskeletal injury history, and that was collected from their initial medical intake forms. Their concussion history, so that was collected through the impact test, so all of our athletes do a baseline impact test at the beginning of every season. At the beginning of the test, the impact asks them how many concussions they've had in the past, so that's where I got that from. Their playing status, so we broke this into 3 categories, whether they dressed in 0 games, whether they dressed in 1 to 2 games, or whether they dressed in 3 or more games. For that season, it was an 8 or 6-game season. Neurocognitive performance, we used 5 different composite scores from the impact test. Again, they all did that at the beginning of the season prior to their first game. And the measures that we gathered was verbal memory, visual motor speed, reaction time, and impulse control. So over the course of the season, we had 16 participants sustain lower extremity musculoskeletal injuries, so that was only about 18% of them. Of those who got injured, the mean injury severity was 3.77 days, with a standard deviation of 10.24 days. The only significant predictor, or the only significant variable able to predict whether injury occurred or not was having played in 1 to 2 games. So I thought that was interesting because a lot of the research does show that the more games you play in, the more you are exposed to potential injuries, so the more likely you are to become injured. But our group who played in 1 to 2 games got injured more than our group who played in 3 or more games. And that was the same thing for the logistic regression, also with the injury severity. Those who sustained more severe injuries were in the 1 to 2 games. And then none of the neurocognitive measures actually showed a significant relationship to getting injured or injury severity. However, impulse control was the best predictor. And what impulse control is basically the sum of the errors that you make on some of the tests within the impact test. So I don't feel like it tells us a whole lot. I was mostly looking for something that was trainable, like reaction time, for example. You can train in the off-season and decrease, and potentially decrease your risk for injury. But the impulse control, I believe, is difficult to train because it's basically the number of errors that you make. Okay, so we did have a few limitations to the study. The first one, our assumptions were violated. So the assumptions of homoscedasticity, linearity, and normality were all violated within the data. I think that could have to do with potentially a small sample size we had, and only having 16 athletes actually sustaining injuries over the course of the season. Next, I guess we're going to talk about the small sample size. The next thing is the short follow-up period. So we only followed their injuries for 11 weeks. That was the total length of their season this past year. Having a longer follow-up period, potentially multiple seasons, would give us more injuries and then therefore give us more data. So to conclude, there's no significant contribution of neurocognitive performance on injury onset or severity, and 1 to 2 games played was the only significant contributor or predictor to predict injury onset and severity. Any questions?
Thank you, Erica. Question for Erica? Yep.
Thanks, Erica. Was there any relationship between your reaction time at their baseline versus their injury?
Like, what do you mean about injury?
So I think all the athletes do baseline testing, correct?
Yes.
And then, was there any relationship between that test and then when they came back to do another test?
So we never measured their reaction time again. We only did the baseline measurement. We never measured it again.
Okay. And then with the reaction time test, was it based on the impact?
It was, yeah, impact. So it's a reaction time composite, which is based off of, I think, 3 different tests within the impact. From there, they give you a composite score for your reaction time.
All right. And the studies that you alluded to that did show changes in reaction time, did they also just use the impact as well, or did they other tests?
Yeah, most of them use the impact. I know one of them used the Dynavision, like a visual motor reaction time sort of test, but the majority of them do use impact.
Do you think you would have found any differences had you used the Dynavision?
Yeah, potentially, for sure. That study actually did exactly almost what I did with these football athletes and measured their visual motor reaction time at the beginning of the season and then kind of kept track of their injuries. The reason I chose impact though is just because it's very easily accessible. All of our athletes do a baseline test on the impact already. They don't do baseline testing on the Dynavision, so I would have had to actually get volunteers to participate rather than just using data that we already had.
Thank you.
Just one thing that you didn't mention, and I forgot to ask you about this. What is one major difference between your study and the previous studies you talked about, especially in terms of other variables that are included in your analysis?
Sorry, especially what?
So, like the other study that you mentioned that showed potentially some increased risk with some of the neurocognitive performance variables. Did those studies control for a lot of other variables?
Yeah, what I tried to do was control for other well-known risk factors. So I controlled for history of previous musculoskeletal injury, which I said was the most significant predictor of injury, and then also for history of concussions. A lot of those other tests did control for those variables. And then the other thing I controlled for was playing status, which a lot of tests did control for playing status, but mine was kind of the only one to control for history of injury and history of concussion.
Other questions for Erica?
You mentioned that people who only got into 1 or 2 games compared to more games were more likely to be affected. Do you have any idea why that might be?
So I don't know. I've been thinking about that a lot since we kind of came across this data, but some thoughts that I have could be that those players aren't generally starters, so they're maybe fighting for a starting position or trying to make a good impression, and so perhaps they're sort of doing more risky behaviors in order to try and make themselves a starter. Another thing could be that maybe they're a little bit less conditioned than those who play in 3 or more games. Maybe they have more experience playing in football games compared to, so people who play 3 games have more experience playing in football games compared to the 1 to 2 games. The other thought I had is potentially those players, because they're more in the backup role, maybe they are going into the games cold compared to the starters who are, they do their warm-up and then continue straight into the game. So those are a few ideas I have. I don't know for sure though why we found that.
Thanks, Erica. It's great to see all the progress that you've made. I was just going to ask about the impact in just two questions on the impact in terms of, do you see quite a range of performance on the impact in any of the measures? And then second, can you just tell me more about the impulse control measure? Because I can't remember what you said it detects errors that they make, but what types of errors?
So the range for the impact test, we do see a large range depending on the individual, but something I forgot to mention is that the impact has these built-in invalidity markers. And so they sort of have normative data where they would expect athletes based on, I believe it's their gender and their age, where they would expect them to be. And so if they're outside of that range, then they have an invalid test. And so they're supposed to redo the test. So that's supposed to try to help diminish the risk of people like sandbagging the test or trying to purposely do worse on the test so that if they do get a concussion during the season, that doesn't hold them back from returning to their sport. And so we did have a couple of athletes who had invalid measures, so we removed those athletes from the data. So they're all kind of within that normative range, if that makes sense. And about the impulse control is basically the sum of errors on 3 different tests. So that the impact is basically a battery of tests. You work through it, there's like different tests. They all are measuring different things. The impulse control is the sum of the errors, so like mistakes that they made on 3 tests.
What types of mistakes are they?
So like
pressing the button when you're not supposed to? Or?
Yeah, that could be a mistake. Like they asked them to memorize shapes, and then they asked them what shape this was. Maybe they got the shape wrong. They asked them about like words to recall words. Maybe they got the word wrong. That kind of thing.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you had talked about was, I believe, that you only included athletes that had lower limb injuries. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would the sample size have been larger if you would have included? Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of how many more?
I would say at least double. Sample size. The reason I decided to include only lower extremity injuries is because the research has shown that a difference in your neuromuscular control or neurocognition affects the lower extremities more so than the upper extremities.
We've got time for one more question for Erica. All right. Thank you very much, Erica. And thank you for
described as a progressive neurological disorder that's primarily characterized by nerve demyelination. So what that looks like is here we would have a healthy axon, and can you guys see that first? So this blue parts here, these are the myelin sheaths. With MS, what you would see is the progressive breakdown of those myelin sheaths. So you would get something that looks like this over time. That will impact two things. So first is going to be the transmission speed of the stimulus from point A to point B. And the second one will be the chemical amount that's required to create the actual stimulus. Now, believe it or not, that is not a picture of me last night. That's actually fatigue, which is our next topic. So for my study, we're going to define fatigue as the inability to maintain a desired force output. And fatigue is fairly important when we're talking about people with MS because it's one of the most commonly reported symptoms. Alongside motor weakness or spasticity, but fatigue seems to be at the very top. Now, given that fatigue is fairly relevant and people with MS, we have a couple different ways to classify it. There are two very popular scales. There's the Modified Fatigue Index scale or the Fatigue Severity Scale. Both are retroactive scales that look at more how fatigue affected the individual's life over the past 7 days or 4 days. But the bigger question is, do they actually measure fatigue? Well, I don't know. And mainly it's because fatigue, it depends what type of fatigue you're trying to measure. It depends whether it's central fatigue, peripheral fatigue, if it's perceived fatigue, kind of like the scales are doing. There is some discussion in the literature right now as to whether they're valid sources of fatigue. In some ways they're saying yes, they do measure central and peripheral fatigue, but then on the other side they're saying, hey, fatigue is actually the result of multiple factors coming in together and giving that perception of fatigue. So, yeah, so that's where we come in. The third thing that I really want to hammer down is motor learning. So motor learning is defined as the acquisition or reacquisition, in this case, or modification of movement skills that lead to improved performance by practicing over time. Heavy emphasis on the practicing here. Now, how do we assess motor learning? There's a couple ways that we can do it. We can either A, base it on the level of performance after practice, and we can do a couple measures to try to see what changes are happening internally. One specific to MS here. The big question is, are people with MS able to undergo those adaptations so that we can see whether they were able to acquire and modify specific skills to improve their quality of life? And the answer is yes. Yes, they can. But there's a catch. If we compare them to a healthy type of population, their amount of time that they'll take to get to that point is going to be longer. So, and like relevant matters is, I guess it is, it's going to take a lot more time and a lot more practice, but we can get there, so why shouldn't? Now, to tie fatigue and motor control, there's a really good study by Branch et al. That this is basically basing my study off of. Basically what they were doing is they were doing a upper motor skill task, really. They had two different groups. So the first group was a fatigue group, and the second group was a non-fatigue. And they were trying to see the results of fatigue prior to practice and what happened in following days. So the effects that they were able to see in fatigue are actually pretty nice. If we look at the graph here, on the left side we have the day one, so the day that they came in, and the red line is the fatigue group and the blue line is the non-fatigue group, so that we see that there's no significant differences in performance in the day one. But if we look at day two, we can see that the non-fatigue group was able to achieve a higher level of performance than the fatigue group. So this implies a question as to whether fatigue really affects practice the day off, or does it follow through? Does it have a ripple effect? Interestingly enough, the same type of effect was observed up to the fourth day when they were able to match a similar level of performance than the non-fatigue group. And after reading this, I was really asking myself, like, what would we see in people with MS here? Would it be the same type of result, or if they're already experiencing fatigue fairly often, would they see a difference? Would it be as prolonged as we see in the branch-out study? I don't know. So I roll the dice, and that's what we're doing. So the objective of the study is really to examine the effects of motor system fatigue and motor learning in people with MS. More specifically, we're going to identify the effects of fatigue prior to motor skill training. Now, we're hypothesizing that fatigue will impair skill acquisition with the fatigue limb, and that higher levels of fatigue will be associated with decreased motor learning. For our study design, we're going with a within-subject experimental design. That is just for the feasibility of recruitment. For participants, we're aiming to get 12 participants, 12 adult participants that have been diagnosed with any phenotype of MS, so whether it's primary progressive, secondary progressive, or relapse remitting MS. As well as we are asking that they have an EDSS score lower than 7.5. And that is just to make sure that they're able to undergo the whole practice without getting too fatigued, or they don't have fine motor movement in their upper. Okay, sure. So for the inclusion criteria for the study, if they're taking any medications that are absolute exclusion criteria for TMS, it won't be accepted into it. If they have plates or screws, that may not feel so nice once we're putting TMS on them. If you guys are familiar, it's just it'll basically be a microwave in this, so we don't want that. But this is what my study is going to look like here. So we have 5 visits in total. For the first one, it's just going to be your basic familiarization visit, where they're going to get a chance to practice the skill. We'll get a couple measures of strength and upper motor function. After that, we'll have a 1-week period in which for the second visit, we'll get them to randomize either to the fatigue protocol or non-fatigue protocol. For the fatigue protocol, we're going to ask them to maintain an MBC until we see a 60% drop from their top MBC. For the control group, they're just going to hold a 10% contraction for a matched period of time. From there, we're going to get some measures of the actual skill itself, strength. We're going to do some interpolated twitch techniques to see the amount of central fatigue after the fatigue protocol. And we're also going to do an interlimb transfer test to see how the practice of the skill on one side can either affect or be a gain to the other non-practice side. After that, they're going to do the motor sequence practice, which I'll show you guys what it looks like in a little bit. We'll do the pulse measures. We'll give them a 24-hour time between the second and the third visit. And then on the third visit, it's going to be the same thing as the second one, except there's no fatigue protocol, right? Because we're really trying to see the effects of fatigue post the first day. Now, if you look at the diagram here, this is what the motor sequence skills is going to look like. So we're going to get them to do it with their dominant hand, whether it's right or left. We're just going to ask them. They're going to hold a force transducer in a lateral pinch grip position, so on the lateral section of the index, and just pressing down with their thumb. And for the practice, they're going to do 6 blocks of 30 trials. So the game, I mean, this is my hand-drawn version of the game, but it's a lot fancier than this. Basically, the screen will move at a constant speed from left to right, and then the cursor will be moved depending on the force output on the force transducer. So if you press harder, the cursor will go up. If you press a little bit lighter, the cursor will go down. And then what we're trying to measure here is going to be the time spent on target for each block. Now, for the 4th and 5th session, that's when we're going to get the groups to cross over. So the fatigue group will cross over to the non-fatigue group and vice versa. But because we have many smart people here, they're going to say, well, if they're doing the same practice, of course they're going to get better. Yes, Patrick? Yes. So what we're going to get them to do is we're going to do an inverse motor sequence skill. So if this is what they were doing on the 2nd and 3rd visit, the only thing that we're going to switch is the intensity. So they're still doing the same amount of work, it just looks different. So that they don't recognize it's like, hey, I've done this before, no problem. Now, for the study measures, we're going to get a lot of measures out of this. First are going to be the motor learning measures. So we're going to be looking at time spent on target, like I said before. And we're looking at the interlimb transfer test. That's more of an exploratory measure, but it'll be interesting to see. The strength measures, we're going to use the lateral pinch grip NBC, so the same force transfer that they're using for the game. We're just going to see how the strength changes all the way through. We're going to use the functional measure of the 9-hole peg test and the familiarization session to see if there's any relation between strength and function of the upper limbs. And the fatigue measure that we're using is mainly more for central fatigue, so we're going to be using the interpolated twitch technique. And the cortical spinal measures that we're going to get, we'll be using the TMS-4. We're going to be checking for cortical spinal excitability and cortical inhibition. So this over here is just a picture of what the TMS would look like. So we put the coil on top of a specific motor area that we want to target. We send the stem through, and it will reach the target area. So that's exactly where we want to do it. So that's just the FBI muscle that we're going to target in the study too. And the primary outcomes are going to be the within-group comparison of motor skill performance with the weaker limb. So we're going to be looking at day 2 and day 3, day 4 and day 5. Same thing as branch height. With that, we're going to use a 3-way ANOVA, looking at condition by practice day by time. And we're going to have a plan comparison with the dependent variable being time spent on target. So something like this. And we're expecting to see the same type of response as branch height. If not, it'll give us a good idea as to how to move forward. Now, some of the exploratory outcomes here are going to be that interlimb transfer test. We're going to be looking at how the cortical spinal excitability and cortical inhibition change throughout practice and how fatigue changes those values. And for that, we're just going to be using a repeated measures ANOVA, and the p-value is going to be 0.05. Now, some limitations for the study are going to be applied to the generalizability of the findings, because A, we're not discriminating between types of MS, and we have a really small sample size. But because this is so fairly new in the field and there's not too much out there, it's actually the strength of it. And then for further research, then that's time to specify a little bit more to look if there's a specific phenotype that responds better or worse, and go from there. And the recruitment may be a little bit difficult during the pandemic. Hopefully not. And yeah. So to conclude, what we know so far is that MS is prevalent in Saskatchewan, and a common symptom of MS is fatigue. Fatigue has a negative effect on motor learning, but we don't know how fatigue affects motor learning in people with MS. The benefits of the studies that we're going to start to scratch at the answer here, and hopefully have later clinical implications to see how to best structure the intervention so that we can improve the outcomes and hopefully increase the overall quality of life that people with MS have. Lastly, just a couple of acknowledgements to Arena for pulling us here. Cam, my supervisor, keeps me in the ground. My committee, Darren Cando and John Farley. My lab mates, and of course, the king of all, Crete.
Questions for Ed?
Hi Ed, great job. Thanks for covering a lot of MS so I don't have to spend as much time on it. Can you talk a little bit more about the TMS measures that you're looking at and exactly kind of what they're supposed to be telling you?
Good question. So the TMS will tell us more, because we're doing a short-term study, it'll tell us more about the chemical changes that are happening within the cortical spinal tract. So hopefully with practice, we'll see an increase in the cortical spinal excitability and a decrease in cortical inhibition for the measures, telling us that the nervous system is being a little bit more plastic at that time. However, it may be affected by fatigue. In some cross-educational studies, they've seen that depending on the task, if it's more implicit or explicit, fatigue can actually harm the performance later on too.
Other questions? Question for you, Ed. Because you were talking about, and it might be similar to for you, Kristen, as well too, is that MS is really prevalent in Saskatchewan, but you know that recruitment is a challenge. Do you have some sense about how you might be recruiting your participants?
Every possible way, really. We're going to try to get, or we are in contact with the MS Society in Regina. We're going to try to get in contact with neurologists around Regina, and just word of mouth, really. Hopefully that will do the trick.
Anybody else for questions for Ed? All right, thank you, Ed, and thank you, or good luck with your lecture. Presentation for this morning. So we have Kristen Plandowski. Sorry, I probably just made a mess with that. Who's supervised by Dr. Cameron Mang, and she will be presenting on neurophysiological mechanisms of dual tasking in people with multiple sclerosis. I'll turn it over to you, Kristen.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Fantastic. Okay, so it's not March 11th, but that's okay. So as Irina said, I am looking at neurophysiological mechanisms of dual tasking in people with MS. I'm a graduate student under the supervision of Dr. Cameron Mang and Dr. Sarah Donkers, and she is a professor and physiotherapist at the U of S. Thanks everybody for sticking around for my presentation, and also thank you to Dr. John Barden for being on my committee and providing great questions and feedback throughout my process of my thesis proposal. So I lucked out with Ed going before me, because he covered a lot of the MS stuff, so now I don't have to spend as much time on it. But anyways, MS is a chronic neurodegenerative disease of the central nervous system, and it's characterized by demyelination, neuroinflammation, and focal lesions in both the brain and spinal cord. So the demyelination throughout the brain and the spinal cord leads to impairment in neuronal communication, which relates to slowed signaling resulting from disease-induced structural damage. All right, so common impairments in people with MS are both in the cognitive area and in the motor area. So approximately 40 to 70% of people living with multiple sclerosis are affected by cognitive impairments. So information processing speed is typically the most common one that we see throughout the literature. And other common domains in cognitive impairment that we see is working memory, attention, and executive functioning. And common motor impairments we see are walking difficulties, balance problems, upper limb impairments, including hand dexterity and fine motor movements, and fatigue, which Ed covered very well. So cognitive motor interference is the coupling between cognitive function and motor function in people with MS. So we tend to see in the past literature that cognition tends to be a lot lower in people that also have difficulties with motor skills and suffer from motor impairments. So Erica spoke about dual tasks a little bit, which was great. So dual tasking is the concurrent performance of two tasks that can be performed independently, measured separately, and have distinct goals. So this is really important for kind of differentiating my study from what is out there in the current literature. A lot of the dual tasking studies in people with MS have kind of blurred the lines on what would be a complex single task and an actual dual task, which is unfortunate because I think the literature would be a lot further along. So the dual task effect is typically measured as dual task cost when we're using a dual task paradigm. So dual task cost is essentially how much performance decrease in relevance to a single task. So transcranial magnetic stimulation, also known as TMS, Ed touched on it a little bit. He also stole that picture from me, just in case you guys were going to give him credit for it. But it's a non-invasive brain stimulation technique that can be used to study the excitability of the motor cortex and the corticospinal tract. So we know that, based on past literature, people with MS tend to have differences in their cortical excitability compared to people, healthy controls. So we want to see technically if these measures are also affected when we're dual tasking. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the cortical silent period. So this is the time from the motor evoked potential onset until the return of EMG activity. And this will assess the inhibition along the corticospinal tract. And it's typically reflecting the GABA receptor mediated neurotransmission. And a lot of studies in people with MS tend to use this measure. And it has shown significant differences between healthy controls and people with MS. So the primary purpose of my study is to determine whether changes in the TMS evoked cortical silent period duration, a measure of corticospinal inhibition, applied during dual task performance are different in a group of people with MS compared to a group of age and sex-matched healthy adult control participants. It's quite a sentence. It takes a little a little bit to read. So we hypothesized that we expect to observe an increase in cortical silent period under dual tasking relative to single tasking conditions that are more pronounced in people with MS than their healthy control participants. So we expect differences in the cortical silent period and dual tasking performance between people with MS and healthy control participants to be more pronounced when performing high novelty and high complexity tasks. All right, so the methodology of my study is it's going to be a cross-sectional study, convenient sample. We'll take whoever we can get at this point. We're hoping to have 20 participants, so 10 people with MS and 10 healthy controls. Our inclusion and exclusion criteria are similar to what Ed spoke about. So we want them to be relapse-free for more than 6 months. We want an EDSS score of less than or equal to 6.0. And this is primarily just to ensure that they can perform the specific tasks that we're asking them to do. And we also have to exclude them if there's any contraindications to TMS. Okay, so the flow of my study is they only have to come once, which is fantastic. So prior to participating, we're going to be screening them, and that's just screening for that inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then the study visit itself will take approximately 3 hours. So it's a little bit lengthy, but it'll be fun. That's what I'm going to tell participants. So first, we're going to do our intake and clinical assessment, which I'll speak more about in a moment. And then we're going to do the single motor task, the single cognitive task, and the dual task conditions. And everything will be measured under TMS, aside from the single cognitive task. So I have a lot of outcome measures. But the clinical assessment will essentially include those demographics, the MSIS 29, the single-digit modalities test, a pinch grip strength, and then for the TMS, we're going to be measuring the motor thresholds, the MEP amplitude, latency, and the cortical silent period. For functional performance, we're going to be measuring the motor task, which I will also speak more about in a moment. And that's going to be measured as the root mean square area, or error. And then the cognitive task will be quantified by measuring the amount that they get correct compared to what we gave them. And then the cognitive motor conditions will be measured from the performance under each condition by a predetermined scoring sheet, and that's based on the number of answers that they correctly recall. And then the motor condition is quantified according to the condition, which will depend on the complexity and the novelty, and that will be used to calculate the dual task ratio. So this will be more the clinical assessment itself. So we're looking at that multiple sclerosis impact scale, which is basically just telling us how much MS impacts their daily life. And then we're also going to be looking at the single-digit modalities test and pinch grip strength, which will help us with kind of determining the measures for TMS. So this is my single task and dual task measures. There's quite a few of them, but essentially our single motor task is going to be similar to Ed's. It's going to be just holding a pinch grip with a steady force, and it's going to be looking at keeping it within a bar. The single cognitive task is going to be low novelty, low complexity, and then high novelty, low complexity, which will be recalling 7 numbers and 14 numbers. And then for the high complexity, it'll be recalling numbers and letters in combination. The dual motor task will be toe tapping. So depending on the complexity or novelty of the condition, it'll either be toe tapping to a self-selected rhythm or an external rhythm. And then the dual cognitive motor task will just be that single motor task, the pinch grip, as well as adding in that single cognitive task. So this is kind of what it will all look like when we're actually doing it. So we're gonna have somebody sitting in the chair for the TMS, and that'll be recording the pinch grip and the motor task and the motor cognitive task. We're not measuring TMS for the single cognitive task, and that is only because we can't measure it without using a force transducer. And that's okay, because the single cognitive task will be based more on their ability to recall. So that's a good idea of the cortical silent period. We're looking at how it kind of drops off and the duration of that. So we're thinking that it's going to be quite a bit longer for people with MS. So the statistical analysis is always hard. It is also quite complex. So the main statistical analysis that we're going to use is the cortical silent period. And that's going to be looked at through a two-way mixed ANOVA. And all of the dependent variables that we're looking at will be measured by a two-way mixed ANOVA. And then all our dependent variables will also be expressed as the dual task cost, which that nice little equation shows. Very simple. Okay, so some of my limitations are the study design, because we're not looking at differences over a period of time. It's just one single session, so just a snapshot. Sample size is quite low, but we rationalize that this will be okay because past studies looking at TMS in people with MS there is quite a large difference in those measures. So we're thinking that it still will be quite pronounced. And then including all MS subtypes is also a limitation, but because this is more exploratory, it's a good starting point for the next kind of stage of research. So to conclude, benefits of the study will be that we will hopefully progress the information that we have in dual tasking people with MS, as well as the TMS measures. Clinical implications include hopefully tailoring intervention programs based on not only whether we are seeing a significant difference in TMS measures, but also we're seeing a significant difference in that dual task cost. And by measuring the 4 different conditions, whether that be a low novelty, high complexity, low novelty, low complexity, and vice versa, that'll hopefully allow us to tailor what kind of tasks we are using for intervention methods. So thank you all for coming. You don't want to look at my references because there's a lot, and there's even more in the actual proposal, believe it or not. But I hope that I didn't bore you too much. Thanks so much.
Great question for Kristen.
Are you gonna age and sex match your control group to the MS patients?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. Is this going to be the same group that Eduardo is going to look at?
Hopefully we can convince people to come in for a 6th session.
Yeah. So hopefully there won't be any interaction or problems associated with that group. I wouldn't think so, but although Saskatchewan has a high number of MS, still it's difficult to always get them in. But yeah, no, I think that's still probably okay.
Yeah, we're hoping to kind of, I guess, variables. We're hoping to do it differently in points of time. And also, because my co-supervisors at the U of S, we do have the potential for doing the study in Saskatoon as well if we have more access to a couple of participants, because it is only one session. So that would be helpful also, hopefully.
So do they have a TMS system up at the U of S?
Yeah, I believe so. If not, we can actually just pack up ours and take it, and we'll have to carry it, but we can do that.
They have one that they're borrowing from us.
Other questions for Kristen? I have a question for you, Kristen. You talked about earlier about the idea of this being a dual task situation versus previous literature looked at a complex single task. Can you talk a little bit like how do people differentiate between a complex single task and two tasks, or dual tasking?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of the past literature, whether it be in healthy controls or in people with MS, has tended to look at a walking measure. And some of them will include walking and like holding a glass of water. Whereas an actual dual task has two main goals. So in my study, for example, by using the single cognitive task and the single motor task together, not only are they having to recall those numbers and the letter combinations, but they're also having to focus on keeping that force within the bar. So you're having to allocate your attention, and kind of, we're hoping to see that people with MS will perform lower, but we will find out.
Any other questions for Kristen?
Thanks again. There's some research to suggest that medical cannabis is good for MS. Are you going to exclude those individuals, if any of them are?
I have not thought about that yet. And surprisingly, it wasn't one of the questions that John asked me in my proposal, because there were a lot. But I think that would definitely be worth looking at in terms of what the literature says some of the effects are. I think it would be really important to see if any of those studies have looked at TMS and cannabis, because not everything will affect that excitability. But that's a good point. I should look further into it. But medical history and current list of medications and supplements will help to acknowledge or control for those kind of things.
If you find that there's a large group that are using medical cannabis, would you consider looking at them as well, and maybe making a comparison to another group, your other group? I know it's a lot of extra work, but it provides a lot of information.
Yeah, I think it would definitely be worth considering, given that my study is very exploratory. And it's not like I have enough moving parts to it anyways, like what's adding on a little bit more. But I think also it would depend on how many participants we can get and how many of them actually are on campus or taking cannabis, and if we will actually be able to get a matched quantity of participants to compare to.
Just get out of order and do the extra work. You won't mind.
That's true. That's true.
Anybody else for questions for Kristen? If not, thank you very much again, Kristen, for your presentation. That concludes the session for the morning, so we will have a If anybody has presentations for this afternoon, feel free to go put them up on the computer at the